This is going to be 10.1, Democracy in America, and I'm sorry about any background noise. I am recording at school again. So we are going to start with the primary source, and this one's actually a little bit of a cheat. This is from the 20th century, but it's one of my favorite quotes about democracy from Winston Churchill, who said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others." So, we're going to be talking today about the 1820s and the 1830s, and the biggest political figure of that time period was Andrew Jackson. Whether he lost or won, he was on everyone's minds. And Jackson's a great example of sort of the story of America during this time period. He's a good reflection of it. He was a very young soldier. He was 13 years old when he fought in the Revolution. He received a permanent scar when he was hit on the head by a British soldier with a sword. He was a self-made man. He was a lawyer. He was a Western expansionist who went west with the country. He was a slave owner, and he was a firm believer in wider democracy for white men in America. And so democracy in America, like I said, is still very much focused on white men during this time. But we also see that we are getting a larger number of Americans who have the right to vote during this time by large numbers, and that really changed the political landscape and the kind of person who gets elected president during this time. So let's look at democracy during this time. So when we're saying democracy, what we really mean is that more people have the right to vote. We're not saying all people have the right to vote, but more people have the right to vote. And it took place alongside some of the stuff we were looking at in Chapter 9, Western expansion, the market revolution, more people getting wealthier, more people heading west. And it is one of the more important tenets of our American freedoms along with those two. More states during this time, both old states like the original 13 and new states like Kentucky, are rejecting property ownership and personal wealth as sort of a thing that you need in order to vote. And by 1860, all states except for Rhode Island had removed the property ownership as a voting requirement. So here is, we're going to see a few painting examples during this. And so this is George Caleb Bingham, who is a Missourian, who did a painting called Stump Speaking in 1853, where a guy is giving a speech to the masses, the rich and the poor, the young and the old. And there's actually a poor man who has risen to question or respond to this older man right here, this wealthier man. And so this is the idea that everyone has the right to reply in this sort of situation. Now, American democracy was not always peaceful. It could be loud, it could be violent, it could definitely be partisan, but it was one of the most important tenets of our American freedoms at that time, even though not everyone had the right to it. Especially, this is the thesis statement of Alexis de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville was a French traveler and author who wrote a very famous book about America called Democracy in America, where he said that the belief in democracy, the idea of it, the ideal at least of it, if not the outright practice of it, was one of the defining values of America. That, you know, we saw ourselves as a democratic people, small d, above all else. We believed in the equality of democracy, again, even if it was not in full practice yet. And this was different from a lot of ancient scholars on the subject of democracy who feared that giving too much power to regular people could be politically destructive. We saw that even in early America with the fear of what they called the quote-unquote the mob, that basically, you know, the uneducated rabble could destroy our country if we're not careful. This, we see, is we're turning it the opposite direction and saying that everyone, rich or poor, educated or not educated, as long as you're a white male, has or should have the right to vote. So here he is, Alexis de Tocqueville, the man, 1805 to 1859, born in Paris, and he was an author, and later on he was the French Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he visited America to study our prison system, but he actually came to interview famous Americans, to talk to a lot of Americans, and ended up writing a book about it with his friend. And also, he was part of the French Revolution period, and so his great-grandfather actually lost his head during the Reign of Terror. His family lost a lot of prestige during the Reign of Terror, did the de Tocquevilles. So, One of the ways that we could ensure the possibility of a good democracy in America is to have an informed democracy. And so this is the time period where we're seeing, along with the market revolution, this is the growth of the information revolution, both for money and for educational purposes. We saw newspapers and magazines becoming available. Many of the newspapers were transported across the country on trains and other devices so that more and more people could read what's going on and be better informed. And also the cost of printing goods had been reduced, so this was a time where you could start up a newspaper and make a living based on it too. So there was also a rise in sort of causes that newspapers had. So for instance, some had a specific target audience. There were abolitionist newspapers, women's journals, Native American newspapers. We already saw in a previous chapter Anzeiger des Westens, which is the German-American speaking newspaper. And so there were newspapers that had separate sort of people who followed them. And this was part of the idea of a growing small d democracy that, in order to have a good functioning democracy, you need to have an informed voter base. So here is another painting from Richard Eaton Woodville in 1848 called War News from Mexico, where we see that a man is reading out the news of the newspaper on the steps of the hotel and post office right here, and that everyone is listening, young, old, rich, poor, black, white. They are all listening about what's going on in Mexico. Now, while democracy was at this time being hailed as sort of the American standard, it's the thing that, again, we all prided ourselves on, according to de Tocqueville, there are still large groups of people who were not able to vote at all. Primarily black people and women were not allowed to vote. And both groups were seen by white men of the time as below them in the social hierarchy and unfit for the choice of voting. The question of who gets to vote is actually still very controversial today. If you look at things like immigration, if you look at people who used to be in prison, areas where poor people can and cannot vote, this is still a very important and controversial topic that we are still focusing on, the idea of democracy meaning everyone who gets to vote. And so let's look at a little bit more about race during this time. African Americans found themselves deeply disenfranchised from this democracy at this time. They were very on the lower scale of the hierarchy, both enslaved and free. First of all, culturally, this was partially because they were portrayed in a certain way by white people who would smear their face with ash or black cork, and they would appear as African Americans in what are called minstrel shows. And oftentimes they would portray African Americans as unintelligent, lazy, unprepared for having a voice in democracy, uninterested in having a voice in democracy. Sometimes they were portrayed as sort of what they called putting on airs, which means that they were portrayed as trying to act above their station but getting it wrong the entire time. Or they were portrayed as happy with their life, that they were down on the plantation, strumming a banjo, singing My Old Kentucky Home, and happy with their lot in life. Content, almost as childlike, almost, is the way they're portrayed in these minstrel shows. And the owners who owned these enslaved people were portrayed as doting, kindly, sort of like, almost like parents to children. Now, while barely any states overtly at first denied African Americans the right to vote, many of them set up restrictions to make sure that none of them could. And as time went on, we do see that this does become more overt. This becomes explicit. This becomes that, yes, this is voting in a democracy is for white men only, at least during this time pre-Civil War. So this, by the way, is Jim Crow. If you ever heard the Jim Crow South, it's based on a minstrel show character named Jim Crow, which was it was a popular song during the 1830s. This is the guy who invented Jim Crow, a man named Thomas Rice, who was a minstrel show actor. This is him at the Bowery Theater in New York City in 1833. Now, let's look at nationalism and its discontent. So this was a time where there was a lot of nationalism, a lot of interest in America doing things as a large country, but also the idea that some people were very sectional as well, that there were some people who said we should not be acting as one large country, instead we should be acting as a small state governments. So after the War of 1812, many Americans wanted to keep these sort of physical ties that bound us together. They wanted a more nationalistic country. Young congressmen from the West, guys like Henry Clay, called for what he called was the American system, which was a series of policies that would grow American power and American money. And this came out of worries that the wanting to grow American power and money, that basically our infrastructure was falling behind England's, that we were not keeping up with England, and we wanted to prove that we were equal to them, if not better. Here, by the way, is Henry Clay. He's going to be a very important guy for the next few chapters. So Henry Clay was born in 1777, died in 1852. He is from Virginia, lived most of his life in Kentucky, where he was a senator and a congressman. Later on, he's going to be Secretary of State under John Quincy Adams. He was one of the war hawks calling for war with England during the War of 1812. And he actually ran for president 3 times and put his name out quite often, but he never quite won the presidency. He's one of the most famous, never quite making it guys in the White House. Him and William Jennings Bryan in the 20th century. Now, the American system had 3 main goals. First, they wanted to create a new national bank. So Hamilton had started our first national bank, and it had a lifespan of 20 years. When its charter expired in 1811, it was allowed to expire with it. He also wanted a tax on manufactured goods not made in America, so he wanted what's called a tariff. And this would inspire people. They thought if the price of imported goods went up, then people would be more likely to buy American goods. Lastly, the American system wanted to build up America's infrastructure, building lots of roads and canals to crisscross the eastern United States. And that way we would always be able to ship things very easily back and forth across the country. Now, some of these worked, some of them didn't. Congress passed a bill to expand America's infrastructure, but it was actually vetoed by President James Madison right at the end of his presidency because he was afraid that such a large national product would be dangerous to local interests, state liberties, Southern interests especially. The tariffs were passed. We had the tariff of 1816 focused on cotton, and it was supported by the South because it would help out the South. And lastly, we had a brand new Bank of the United States created in 1816, and it would last until 1836, although it went out a little bit earlier than that. We'll see that later on. So here's the first ever Bank of the United States, built in 1791 in Philadelphia. When it closed in 1811, now it's become a historical site. So the Second Bank of the United States had a lot of power during this time. It was an independent bank. But it was sort of like an independent bank that had very close ties to the American government. It served as the financial agent for the U.S. government, although it was technically private. It issued a lot of paper money. It collected taxes. It paid government debts. However, they were unpopular at the time because they were in competition with local banks. Remember, this is a time when the economy is booming, at least for the moment. And the local banks could also issue paper money. This is not the case anymore. Nowadays, only the Federal Reserve can distribute paper money, but back then, local and state banks could also distribute it. Back then, paper money was more or less an IOU that you could turn in at a bank for what is called specie, S-P-E-C-I-E, which means hard currency, gold or silver. And the number of local banks was rising due to the large market revolution going on, and also the Bank of the United States could demand this specie from local banks in exchange for paper money. So they were in direct competition with these local banks. And that's about as much economics as I can do without my head hurting. But let's do a little more economics, I guess. So the Bank of the United States is also a private company. They got involved with speculation, which is especially with buying up American land in the West. Speculation more or less translates to economic gambling. They were gambling that the price of things were going to keep going up in the West and would never go down, and spent money like that was going to happen. So as more and more people headed west, the Bank of the United States gave out paper money loans to land speculators. And also with Britain and France at war, people were buying lots and lots of American goods, and so the prices of things and the money that was being made was just going up and up and up and up. However, when this finally settled down in 1819, the economy crashed, leading to what is called the Panic of 1819. It only lasted about a year, but it had long-term repercussions. Western states like Kentucky refused to collect loans from poor farmers, which helped the farmers, but was bad for the national banks. They also printed lots of paper money not backed by gold, which again was helpful to the farmers because they could pay off their debts, but it hurt investors who basically were given a lot of worthless money. It also deepened this sort of American distrust of banks, and we see this especially among guys like, we're going to see this with Andrew Jackson in 10.2, that Jackson does not trust the banks, especially the big banks. They are seen as corrupt, they are seen as sort of domineering and controlling these Eastern banks controlling Western land, and they blame the Bank of the United States for causing this financial crisis in the first place. Now, in 1819, the state of Maryland actually tried to do something about this. They tried to tax one of the branches of the National Bank in Baltimore. The question of whether or not a state had the right to tax a national bank went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where John Marshall, remember John Marshall, he's very important. John Marshall passed McCulloch v. Maryland. He ruled on this Supreme Court case, McCulloch v. Maryland, saying that a national bank was allowed. First of all, they were saying at first, like, is a national bank even allowed? Because there's nothing in the Constitution that says we can have a national bank. But Marshall said, yes, it is allowed because there's a clause called the Necessary and Proper Clause that says that Congress has the right to do whatever it needs to if it is necessary and proper for the upkeep of our nation. And he said that a national bank does help out our nation. This also opened up the idea that Congress and the Constitution has implied powers, powers that are not explicitly stated but sort of hinted at. And so this was a huge Supreme Court ruling. And it also said that the state of Maryland did not have the right to tax a national bank, which was the real, that was kind of the meat and potatoes of the whole thing. But the power to tax a bank could lead to the destruction of a bank, so Marshall argued that the states could not overrule something created by the national government. So this is a very important kind of load-bearing decision by John Marshall. It has a lot of moving parts to it. Now, let's look at another sectional dispute during this time in 1820. James Monroe became president. He's our last Federalist, easily defeating the last Federalist candidate. He's also the last of the sort of the founding father generation, as James Monroe. This was also the time period where the Federalist Party was ending, and it led into a time period where we had only one political party, the Democratic Republicans of the Jeffersonian side. And so during this time, since there was only one political party, there seemed to be, on the surface at least, this sort of people were getting along with each other, so they called it the era of good feelings. It's pretty easy to get along when everyone's part of the same party. However, not everyone was feeling so good during this era of good feelings, and we see it's not going to last. So here's our fifth president, James Monroe, 1817 to 25, from Monroe Hall in Virginia. He was a soldier during the American Revolution. He was a congressman, a senator, ambassador to France and to England, governor of Virginia, secretary of state, secretary of war. Again, you see a lot of these presidents back then had big resumes. He was with Washington at the Battle of Trenton. There's the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. James Monroe is the one holding the flag in that. And also, he was the one who had the first White House wedding, although it was not him, it was his daughter. His daughter Maria was the bride at the first White House wedding. Now, one of the main issues during this time period was the rise of sort of Western expansion and how it impacted slavery in the United States. Because at this time, we had an equal number of states that allowed slavery and free states. And so the only thing that could mess this up was if an odd number of states basically were in the Union. And that's exactly what was going to happen when in the early 1820s, Missouri asked to become a state. And a lawman named James Talmadge of New York basically said that if Missouri is going to become a state, they need to stop the influx of enslaved people into Missouri, and that also anyone in Missouri who is enslaved is going to be eventually, slowly over time, freed. And the debate got very heated about whether or not Missouri was going to be a slave state, whether we should have an imbalance of slave states and free states in the Union, and it divided the nation pretty much along party lines. But eventually there was a compromise passed. So Missouri would enter the United States as a slave state, and Maine, a new state, would enter as a free state in order to keep the all-important balance of slave and free states equal. And they also drew a line across the country that basically started at the bottom of Missouri and went westward across the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, and it said that slavery would be banned above that line, what's called the 3630 line. And these 3 points are called the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay later stopped Missouri's constitution from outright banning free blacks, and so there was a compromise made at this time, and we were able to sort of move the issue of slavery down the road once again. So this is a map of the Missouri Compromise. I would say you should probably know this map for a good short answer for your tests, and also because it's an important map. Now, the question of slavery in America was not simply moral during this time, although it was definitely moral as well. It was also a political calculation. Many northern states were convinced that southern states had sort of a power hold on the presidency because 4 out of 5 of the U.S. presidents at that point had been from the slave-owning South. And so they thought that, things like the 3/5 Compromise were giving a lot of power to the South. And so they believed that if we allow slavery into more and more states, the South is just going to become more and more powerful, and that northern states are going to be left out. The biggest fear of both sides is what's going to happen as America heads west. How are we going to be able to avoid the sort of Missouri Compromise style arguments that we had every time we add a new state to the Union? And we're going to see this is going to be an issue heading down the line. So let's look at nation, section, and party now. So from 1810 to 1822, many colonies in Central and South America were rebelling against their colonial owners. So places like Mexico, Venezuela, Central and South America were rebelling against Spain and France. And this led to the question of how America felt about these rebelling colonies, and would we support them? And we did sympathize with them because they were sort of like us. They were, their attempts at freedom mirrored our attempts to free ourselves from England. Venezuela, if you look at their Declaration of Independence, it borrows directly from America's, and so you can see that there is sort of this common link between the two. So here is a map of North and South America during this time, and you can see that by the 1830s, most of the Central and South America has freed itself from colonialism, except for British Honduras, Cuba, Guyana, Dutch Guyana, French Guyana on the South American coast. But you can also see the dates that these Central and South American countries became independent. Now, the fear, America's fear at least, was that Europe would decide to reconquer these colonies that they had just lost. And this actually led James Monroe and his Secretary of State, who actually wrote most of the document, to add a section to the message that Monroe gave to Congress, known as the State of the Union. And this became known as the Monroe Doctrine. But basically what it said was that the United States would oppose any further colonization of the Americas by Europe, that we did not want Europe coming over here and creating any more colonies in America. Now, the way that we would ensure this is we would say that we, a growing, powerful nation, would stay out of European wars, and we would maintain that sort of neutrality that Washington had started. We also said, however, it was a warning that if America tried to interfere with any of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, we would defend them. So basically, we were saying that we were going to be defending Latin America. So here is a more modern political cartoon, but the whole idea that Uncle Sam is sort of the guardian of America, keeping out all these European despots over there on the left. Now, the Monroe Doctrine came to be the cornerstone of American foreign policy for many years. We pointed back to the Monroe Doctrine to sort of explain why we were doing certain things diplomatically when it came to foreign policy. It also declared the United States as the power of the Western Hemisphere. We are declaring ourselves the biggest power, but also the biggest defender of the Western Hemisphere. And so John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State under James Monroe, hoped that this would open up Latin America to U.S. business interests above all others as well. So it was partially sort of an idea of, America defending liberty in the Western Hemisphere, but it was also a practical economic idea at the same time. So let's look at the elections of this time period. In 1824, the presidential race focused on Andrew Jackson. He had been the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. He was a war hero. He was a Western governor. He seemed to be sort of the new, fresh face of America. Meanwhile, other nominees, we had 3 other people running for president, which really shows the divisions sort of growing at this time. We had a Western candidate, we had a Northern candidate with John Quincy Adams, we had another Western candidate with Henry Clay, and we had William Crawford of Georgia, who was a Southern candidate and was sort of the establishment candidate. Crawford suffered a stroke early on, sort of was out of the running, but there were still 3 other people running. The fact that we had this many people running for president showed that there was sort of an end to this one-party system that had been going on during the Monroe era. It was fracturing across sectional divisions. So here are the 3 right here, and so you can see that they are all from different areas of the country, Clay and Jackson both being from the West. Now, with 4 candidates on the ballot in 1824, the number of votes got split 4 ways, so nobody had a clear majority. And when nobody has a clear majority, this goes to Congress. Even though Jackson got the most popular votes, he did not have enough electoral votes to declare himself the victor. Adams was in second place. Now, Congress got to decide in this sort of situation who gets to be the president. Henry Clay, who was the most powerful man in Congress, put his support behind John Quincy Adams. He thought that Adams was the most qualified candidate. And this meant that Adams, who did not get the most popular votes, got to be president. And very soon after he became president, he appointed Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, which raised a lot of eyebrows because the Secretary of State was seen as a way to sort of jump into the presidency, which Henry Clay very obviously wanted. So here's our 6th president, John Quincy Adams, 1825 to 29. He is a one-term, just like his dad. He is from Braintree, Massachusetts. He was our minister to Netherlands, minister to Prussia, minister to Russia, minister to Great Britain, senator from Massachusetts, and Secretary of State. Again, a lot of the presidents during this time had a long resume. He's also the only president who became a congressman after becoming president. So he went from the executive branch to the legislative branch after being president. One time he was also caught skinny dipping by a female reporter. He used to bathe in the Potomac River every morning, and she sat on his clothes and ordered him to give her an interview, and he did so standing waist high in water. He also died while he had a stroke while giving a speech against slavery on the House floor. And for those of you who like ghost stories, allegedly, if you go to the U.S. Capitol, you can still hear John Quincy Adams trying to finish that speech. So the whisperings of a corrupt bargain were also heard during this time. That's what they called it, the corrupt bargain, that Adams basically had made a deal behind the doors with Clay that he would get to be president as long as Clay got to be Secretary of State. And this accusation, while not proven, Henry Clay also was a good choice, but it really wrecked both of their careers. It ensured that Adams would be a one-term president, and Clay never got into the White House, and this really ruined his chances. Quickly after the election, The idea of a single Democratic Republican Party, the one founded by Jefferson and Madison, split down the middle. Supporters of Andrew Jackson left this party and started the Democratic Party, and we see the Democratic Republicans. That party just kind of falls apart. And supporters of John Adams and Henry Clay would leave to create a new party, the Whigs. And so we're seeing that this 1824 election got rid of the old party, split up the new parties, and now we have new parties for a new generation. Now, John Quincy Adams is a very accomplished man. He had a very long resume, like we saw. He was a diplomatic genius, and he was very brilliant. He was just not very well liked, again, much like his dad. He had a lot of big ideas for America, nationalistic ideas. He was a supporter of the American system. He wanted to increase American trade and commerce around the world. He had expanded the land of America by acquiring Florida in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. He also fixed our northern border with Canada at the 49th parallel. He also believed that America would keep expanding. He was an expansionist. He believed that it was only natural that America eventually manifest destiny itself and overspread all the way to the Pacific Ocean, into Mexico, into Canada, into the Caribbean. So here's the 49th parallel. Adams had very large goals for his administration. He wanted to create an American university. He wanted to create an American observatory. He wanted to create an American Naval Academy. However, by this time, America was turning against nationalism and more towards state power instead. And so while Adams said that liberty is power, many Americans were like, actually, liberty like this at the big government level is tyranny. So this led to Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party calling for a new way of voting and a new design for America. The Democratic Party railed and rallied against all of Adams's ideas. They said that they wanted a small federal government. They wanted more states' rights over national rights. They wanted individual liberties instead of group liberties. And many Democrats who sided with Jackson were very much of Jackson's mold. These sort of self-made men rose up out of poverty, moved west, many of them. They argued that multiple political parties, which used to be seen by Washington as a detriment, were actually a good thing because they helped to unite leaders of different regions and also made sure that a diversity of voices were heard. Now, one of the templates of this new man of this time was Martin Van Buren. Van Buren was a senator from New York who helped to create the Democratic Party. He was almost like Andrew Jackson's hype man in a way, and later on he would become president for a term as well. He started life very poor in upstate New York as the son of a tavern keeper who spoke Dutch most of his life until he learned English. So here is Martin Van Buren, who once said, "There's a power in public opinion in this country, and I thank God for it is the most honest and best of all powers, which will not tolerate an incompetent or unworthy man to hold in his weak or wicked hands the lives and fortunes of his fellow citizens." In 1828, the Democratic Party of Van Buren and Jackson had created a very efficient party system across the country. They had leaders in every party or in every state. They had organized literal parties, celebrations where people would go listen to a speech for a Democratic candidate, then they would get barbecue and booze, basically. And so there was an organized setup in every state. They were also more than happy to do mudslinging. Both sides were. When Jackson and his compatriots talked about Adams, they came up with a lot of different ideas, including the fact that Adams had been procuring American women to be for the Tsar of Russia during his time as ambassador to Russia. On the other side, Jackson's enemies said that he was a murderer as he had killed several people in duels. They also attacked his wife, which is really dirty politics. Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel, had married Andrew Jackson before her first divorce was finalized, and she died right before the election was over of 1828. And Jackson, who held a grudge, never forgave his enemies for her death. He said right up until the end that they had killed her. There's a famous quote that Andrew Jackson's on his deathbed, and he's surrounded by friends and family, and they said, "Mr. Jackson, do you have any last regrets?" And he said, "Yes, I didn't shoot Henry Clay, and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun." The man held a grudge. In the end, he also won in a political blowout. He was helped by the fact that what we've been talking about, democracy, small d democracy, more people were being allowed to vote during this time. More white men were being allowed to vote. And that helped thrust Jackson into the White House. His party had shown that a organized, driven, forceful political group could become powerful in American politics, and this would become the template for future presidential races as well. So we will take a look at the Jackson presidency next time.